Welcome to the video on the subjunctive mood. The subjunctive is a mood, and to this point in our study of verbs we've talked about verbs and verbal words that are participles, and the verbs were all indicative. And the participles, well, we just parse them in the mood box as participles because they have noun endings and they don't share all the characteristics of indicative verbs. They function a little differently. Well, now we're going to talk about subjunctive verbs. They're not indicative because indicative is generally the mood of reality, things that really happen or have happened or will happen. The subjunctive is the mood of possibility or probability. And when we talk about the subjunctive verbs, we're going to see that the aspect is of primary importance. So in the indicative, when we see a verb, we parse it as a present. It's generally happening in the present. There's also the historical present, which happens in the past, but generally they're present tense. They happen in the present. Then there's the future, an action that's going to happen at some point in the future. We've got two past tenses. Well, when we talk about the subjunctive, it's not so much the timing, it's the aspect that is of primary importance when we're analyzing just the verb or the word itself. And we're going to see that there's two tenses, the present or the continuous subjunctive and the aorist or the undefined subjunctive. So the subjunctive in English has to do with the way we can approach it is by thinking of reality versus probability. So here's a sentence here, and it's an example sentence that doesn't work. I possibly go to the market. Well, if you look at that, what is wrong with that? We should realize that doesn't sound quite right. What's wrong with that? Possibly is kind of an indicator word that shows us the action of going is not for sure, right? We wouldn't say, I possibly go to the market. We would say, I may possibly go to the market. That sounds fine. And that's because a lot of times when we're constructing a sentence that has a verb, that is just a possibility or a probability, we often include the keyword may or might, and then it sounds fine. And those two go together very nicely. Possibly goes with may. And so we're going to find that when we translate these subjunctives, a lot of times we're going to have to include may or might in the translation. The equivalent of the Greek subjunctive in English. Okay, there's not a perfect correspondence between the way subjunctives work in English and how they work in Greek, but there is some overlap. For instance, they can be signaled by context or certain words in the context. So in English, a lot of times, even if we don't include may or might, it's the context that helps us understand the action didn't really happen, or maybe it possibly happened, it possibly will happen, but it's the context. Other times, like we saw above, it's also key words in the context, like possibly. Okay, well that word makes clear to us that the action is not for sure. But anyway, here's an example. Whoever went to the store should have bought me a snack. Now the reason went to the store here is more in the subjunctive category. This kind of construction would definitely be written as a subjunctive in Greek. In English, it might be a little harder to think of that verb went as subjunctive, but the fact is that we don't know who went. Somebody went, but we're not sure who. In Greek, that would be followed by subjunctive verb, and in that sense we might think of the verb here as kind of a subjunctive mood. Or another word that indicates kind of a conditional action is the word if. If I go to the store, I will buy you a snack. That's a contextual word that tells us that it's not the action of the clause is not for sure. Or other words, possibly could appear in the context, or probably, words of purpose or phrases of purpose like in order that and desire, I wish I had. Well, all of those illustrate how the subjunctive or the idea of the subjunctive could appear in English, and we'll have to translate sometimes using these words. The nice thing about the actual forms of the subjunctive in Greek is that they all have indicative endings. We've already studied the indicative verbs, and there's nothing new to learn as far as the endings, and that should be encouraging. And there's just a little feature that's different, and that is that the connecting vowel lengthens. So let's take a look at the forms. We should have memorized, or at least not too far in the back of our memories, luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, lusin. Well, if you look at these forms, they're almost exactly alike. The only difference is that the connecting vowel has lengthened. The omicron becomes omega in the first plural and in the third plural, and the epsilon has shifted to eta because it lengthened. And the difference would be that these are subjunctive. They have a lengthened connecting vowel, and they'll appear in contexts of probability or possibility, or sometimes in conditional phrases and clauses. And so we've got the translation might be for luo, I may loose, or lues, you may loose, lue, he, she, or it may loose, and so on. So if we're just looking at the word and we're parsing, we'll include may or might. But sometimes when we're actually translating them, we might drop the may or might, as we'll talk about in a second. So the key here is the lengthened connecting vowel. That's how we can identify the subjunctive. And here's what the middle passives look like for the present or continuous subjunctive. Luomai, lue, luitai, luomitha, luesthe, luomtai. These would be translated passive voice. So instead of I may loose, this would be I may be loosed. Remember, if it's passive, middle passive voice, if it's passive, we want to include that helping verb be to make clear that the subject is being acted upon. And if it's middle, it might be deponent, or we might want to translate it more reflexively. We have to look at the context and the word itself to determine that. For the aorist, there's no augment, and that's because they don't indicate past time as such. They're focusing more on the aspect. And these are also going to take primary endings. Remember, the augment always goes with the secondary endings, and so these are actually going to take primary endings. And with one shift in the tense formative, instead of sigma alpha, they're just going to take the sigma, and instead of the theta eta for the passives, they're just going to take a theta. So let's look at the forms here. Luso, luces, luce, lusomen, lucete, lusosin. Don't confuse these aorist forms with the future forms. Some of them look a lot like the future forms. The difference between the two will be these have a lengthened connecting vowel. They just have a sigma, like the future tense formative, but these also have a lengthened connecting vowel. Normally in translation, it's going to be very hard to distinguish how we might translate these differently from the present. A lot of times, in my opinion, I don't think the author wanted so much to focus on whether it's continuous or undefined action. I think sometimes it was just stylistic. It had to do with their maybe the way the word was said or the way the tense was used in their region. Sometimes there might be a difference, but we want to be careful we don't focus on that difference too much. So the translation would again be something like I may lose. In some circumstances, if we sense by studying the context that the author is focusing on, for instance, if it was a present or continuous subjunctive, focusing on the aspect, we might translate it, I may continually lose. But most of the time, that I think is a stretch. And then we've got lusomai, luce, lucetai, lusomitha, lucesthe, lusontai. These would be the middle forms. And again, sometimes the middle forms are going to be deponent, just translated actively, like I may lose for lusomai. Other times they might just be pure middles and more reflexive. I may lose myself would be another option for these. And here's what the passive forms look like. We've got lutho, luthes, luthe, luthomen, luthete, luthosin. Instead of taking theta eta, they just have a theta, and they take, again, the primary endings, and they have a lengthened connecting vowel. A little strange, they take the active endings. We think, well, it's passive. We've already seen that for other aorist verbs and the aorist participles, that there's usually some kind of active feature in the passive form. So these take the active endings. The second aorists do not have a tense formative, and they form directly from the verbal root. This should sound pretty familiar because that's just how the indicative aorist, second aorist verbs formed, and that's how the second aorist participles formed as well. So if we saw lambano in the subjunctive form, this is how it would appear. From the root itself, labo, labes, labe, labomen, labete, and labosin. These form a lot like the present subjunctives or the continuous subjunctives. The difference is that they form directly from the root, and when this happens, the root is going to look differently from the present tense stem. So labo would be translated I may take or I may receive. These all form from ginomai, and ginomai is a deponent verb, so that means all of these would have more of an active translation, and these form directly from the root of ginomai, which is gen. So genomai would be translated I may be, or I may exist, or something like that. Genomai has a broad lexical range. Phino and phines and phine, this list, they come from phyneo, which is actually the deponent verb, but it forms passively. And a lot, if not the majority, of aorist passive subjunctives are actually going to be deponent. And so these would be translated I may shine, or you may shine, or he, she, or it may shine. Sometimes we will include may or might in the translation, like we talked about, but very often the contextual indicators, those words like if or whoever or possibly or probably, allow for the translation of the verb, just the verb itself, without the key words may or might. And we're going to see that as we look at some examples of the subjunctive in the New Testament. This little word hina is important. It occurs a ton of times, and it normally indicates purpose or desire, and it's always followed by the subjunctive in Greek. So here's an example. This would be translated, and Jesus said, I have come into this world for judgment. And now we're in the middle where hina appears, and it's in bold font, in order that, and then it's followed by blepontes, which is a participle, and bleposin, which is a subjunctive. It comes from blepo, and notice that it's the third plural, and it has an omega instead of an omicron. That's because it lengthened, it's subjunctive, and it follows hina. So back to the English translation, in order that those who do not see, that's how I translated blepontes, might see. And those who see, another participle, blepontes, tu floi means those who are blind, genontai. Okay, that's the one from genomites, third plural, it's deponent. It has the idea of might be made blind. In order that those might see and those who see might be made blind. The subjunctive is often going to appear with some form of the little word on. A lot of times on is not translatable, and all it's doing in the context is signaling that a subjunctive verb or a subjunctive idea is following. It makes that verbal idea contingent. But a lot of times it's going to be fused with a word, most of which we've already studied. For instance, eon is the fusion of a, which means if, with on, and that means if, or the fusion of hate with on, and that means when. Hasan together means he that or whoever, and eosan would mean until. So let's take a look at how some of these appear, and we'll show that the subjunctive follows. This would be translated, Moses wrote to us that if a man dies, that his brother take or marry his wife. So we've got eon, followed by tinos, a certain one or someone, I just translated it, a man here. Epothane from epothnesko, if he dies. Epothane is the subjunctive. It's got the lengthened connecting vowel there. It's also second aorist. It forms directly from the root of epothnesko. And we don't have to include in our translation here, if a man may die. No, because we understand it's contingent or conditional because of this key word. And so a lot of times we won't have to include the may or might. Moses wrote to us that if a man dies. Here's an example with hatan, which is translated when. By this we know that we love the children of God, and now we've met hatan in our Greek sentence here. Hatan ton theon agapomen. And then the last verb is poiomen. This would be translated, when we love God and do His commandments. In English, we wouldn't be able to tell that these verbs necessarily are subjunctive, but they do have the subjunctive form in the Greek. And that's because this doesn't happen all the time to everybody. This is a little bit conditional, and that's signaled by hatan in the Greek sentence. Now that may not make a great theological or hermeneutical point for us in a sermon. It's just one of the fine differences between the grammar of Greek and the grammar of English. But we do understand by looking at the Greek that this isn't necessarily across the board, but it's a bit of an indicator and a test for those who might claim to be Christians. Well, do they really love God and keep His commandments? Yeah, they should. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and do His commandments. Here's another one that would be translated he that. Chos an thele. He that wants to be first among you shall be servant of all. Asan is indicating a subjunctive follows. Thele is from thelo, which means I desire, I want. So he that wants to be first among you shall be servant of all. And another one, using eosan. This generation shall not pass away, eosan panta tauta genitai, until all these things be fulfilled. So genetai would maybe come to pass or exist. Be fulfilled is probably the best translation contextually. And it's going to happen at some point, but it still hadn't happened, and so it's kind of in that realm of probability. This is a prophecy from Christ, so it's certain, but grammatically it falls into the subjunctive category. And then sometimes we're going to see the subjunctive with the combination ume. These are two negative words, right? Not and not. This is the strongest way to negate a concept in Greek. A good translation might be never or in no way. The King James translators opted for something that was more dynamic, but certainly communicates the very strong negative concept, God forbid. Here's one. He that does not receive the kingdom, hos paidion, as a child, ou me eselthe. Hopefully you can recognize eselthe. That comes from eserkomai. It's a second aorist form. So it's the undefined or aorist subjunctive. Shall never enter would be a good translation, or shall in no way enter. And then one more subjunctive we want to mention here is what's called the ortatory subjunctive. This will appear in the first person plural, and we'll translate it, let us. Now, when we later study the imperative, we'll find that the first person plural doesn't appear as one of the forms, and that's because you can't really command yourself to do something, even if you're part of the group. I command that we go. It doesn't really work that way. But you can give an ortatory subjunctive and say, hey, let's go to the ball game together. And that's how it appears in Greek. It's called the ortatory subjunctive. Here's an example. Agapetoi agapomen allelus. Okay, agapomen has the lengthened connecting vowel, so it's a subjunctive form. But here it's ortatory. It's encouraging, the author's encouraging himself and the ones in his group to do this. Let us love one another. So let's just take a quick review of this subjunctive. Although there are a few other uses of the subjunctive, these are the most common. Hina plus the subjunctive. Or words with an. It could just be an by itself. A lot of times it will be fused with the word like e'an, if. Atan, when. Asan, whoever, or he that, or she that, or eosan, until. Ume plus the subjunctive is the strongest way in Greek to negate a concept, that it may never happen, in no way should this ever happen. And then we'll also sometimes see the ortatory subjunctive. So the subjunctive is a mood. It's still this broad verbal idea that we've been studying for a while, but it generally falls into the category. Sometimes the category is a little murky, but it's the category of possibility or probability, or it's conditional. This should help us as we start to translate the subjunctive to understand how it functions grammatically.